right, welcome everybody to this edition of the Freedom Hub Working Group. I'm Jeff Cantor, your host, along with my co-host Charles Frohman. We are sponsored by your Freedom Hub, where all the activists and entrepreneurs tend to hang out together. All these episodes are recorded. You'll find them at these various channels. This is the link you'll use to register, and then these other ones for BitChute, Brighteon, YouTube are all case sensitive. So if you're watching the videos, make sure you do check that out. Just to give you a little quick thing, we also do a location on LinkedIn that you may want to participate in. There's some great stuff ongoing with this, so please register to be a participant in this. And you'll see we keep releasing videos and updates and so on here, so this is a good group to be a participant. Again, our sponsor is your Freedom Hub. And then here's some of the various locations where these videos are, and you'll see there's a nice collection here on all these. So whichever one you prefer to go to, you'll see there's a lot. The most sit here on Brighteon. We're a little newer on YouTube, so they don't quite go back as far, but there's quite a bit already on there. And so that's where we're coming from. And now we would like to try to bring to you where we're going to be talking today, which is with Bob Chitester. So Charles, if you'll go ahead.
Sure, Jeff, and welcome, Bob. We're very pleased to have this subject today. So many of us in the liberty movement got there, if we're a bit older, in part on Milton Friedman's fantastic production from around 1980, Free to Choose. It was a TV series that I learned later in my activist life was produced by a PBS producer from my hometown of Erie, Pennsylvania, Bob Chitester. Nice coincidence there. In that capacity, Bob runs the Free to Choose network, where with his production skills, he's interviewed countless leaders in liberty thought in all markets. And he's also brought his skills and knowledge of how to translate complex political economic issues into layman's terms to the schools with the website isit.org. I think it's .org, it might be .com.
Correct. Nope, it's .org. Correct.
.org. So what's been interesting with all of our webinars over the past couple of months is, even though we booked them several months ago, many months ago in some cases, with this COVID lockdown, they've become, in most cases, even more relevant. And as we lose our rights out of fear, whether justified or not, this post-COVID new way of recovery from the Greater Recession might not have as much liberty as it did before. So it's always useful in these crises to review fundamentals. And Milton Friedman certainly has a great way of teaching the fundamentals of.
Okay, that is going to be great. All right, Bob, I'm going to give you the floor here. I'm also going to stop sharing so that you can take possession of the screen.
There.
Okay. And you can certainly bring up anything you'd like to show us as well.
Well, I'd like to start with a poem that I read called Summer Storm. And in the background is the library at Kapitoff, and more about that after you've listened to Summer Storm. Dana Gioia, who was for a while actually head of the Endowment for the Humanities, I believe. Some people say the arts, I think the humanities. But in any case, a poet, contemporary poet, whom I highly regard. And this is his poem, Summer Storm. And I'm, people who have spent time with me know that there will not be an event that I'm at where I'm a presenter that does not include poetry, because I love poetry and I integrate it into my commentaries whenever possible. Summer Storm. We stood on the rented patio while the party went on inside. You knew the groom from college. I was a friend of the bride. We hugged the brownstone wall behind us to keep our dress clothes dry and watched a sudden summer storm, floodlit against the sky. The rain was like a waterfall of brilliant beaded light, cool and silent as the stars. The storm hid from the night. To my surprise, you took my arm, a gesture you didn't explain, and we spoke in whispers as if we too might imitate the rain. Then suddenly the storm receded as swiftly as it came. The doors behind us opened up. The hostess called your name. I watched you merge into the group, aloof and yet polite. We didn't speak another word except to say good night. Why does that evening's memory return with this night's storm? A party 20 years ago. Its disappointments warm? There are so many might have beens, what ifs that won't stay buried, other cities, other jobs, strangers we might have married. And memory insists on pining for places it never went, as if life would be happier just by being different. That poem, I think, should touch any individual, I believe, in terms of our memory, our lives, our goals, our objectives, our looking back to assess how well we've done. It also is about choices. And choices describes economics, period. The economic way of thinking is about choices. Why do we decide what we do? What do we decide to do? What are the consequences of those decisions? Can we predict what the consequences of those decisions will be? Every one of those things added up ends up being Friedrich Hayek's emerging order. So when I first meet people and they say, oh, economics, that's very complicated, very difficult. I say, no. It's very simple. All you have to do is keep in mind choices and let your mind go through a normal series of questioning what you see, giving your own assessment, taking your own assessment of what you see and what you hear, and making choices based on that. That's economics. That's economics in action. Now, one of the things that we are focused on, and in fact, a few personal comments. One, I'm rather hoarse today. A little later in our presentation, I'll play a couple of videos that I recorded this past summer, and that'll give you a real basis for judging how hoarse I am. That's because I'm near the end of a I say near the end, difficult to predict when you have stage 4 cancer of any kind, when it will win and you will lose. In my case, the prostate cancer stage 4 is to the point after 7 years of very successful treatment, and I have no complaints with regard to that at all. I've enjoyed many more years than I anticipated I would at the beginning. But now I'm taking chemo, and one of the side effects of the chemo is that for the first, say 10 days, 8 to 10 days after the infusion, I have this problem with my mouth dry and hoarseness in the throat. So occasionally I'll be grabbing for cough drops. Based on my consumption, you ought to buy stock in Ricolo, the Swiss cough drop company. But I'd like to start off then by giving you a sense of what my focus is at this point, and in the context of my situation and the fact that I have to be very direct in my own thinking, that I have a limited amount of time to continue to build on what I hope will be a kind of a Friedman Chitester legacy. And my primary focus right now is on developing Kappa-Toph. Now we have a series of 3 photos I want to share with you of Kappa-Toph. The first one is a shot of Kappa-Toph from the pond, which is down the hill from Kappa-Toph. Kappa-Toph is reflected in the pond along with a gorgeous tree in between. It's twilight, you can see the lights in the building. This is the summer home that Milton and Rose Friedman built. And when I say built, they designed it. The materials that were used to build it, many of the woods that are used in the building were from lumber that was cut on the property and then was kiln dried and used in the home. And the next shot I want to show you is why Milton and Rose picked this site, because that's what Vermont looks like from Milton and Rose's Kapitoff. And if you look in the very far right, and if the transmission is accurate and your eyes are good, you can see misted over one of Vermont's high mountains. Now, oh gosh, and I'm trying to think which one it is. Can't remember the name now. I may think of it in a bit. That was it. Yes, you're right. Thanks, Jeff. There it is. And it's one of those high mountains like Mount Washington. And I can't, I'm being blocked. The other thing to note is note where the pond is and how far down the hill it is from the house. That's going to be something that will come up again later. Now the final picture is I decided that Milton and Rose loved Kapitoff. We took them there in 2003 to do some video recording with them as part of our 90-minute biography of Milton that was broadcast by PBS in 2004, I believe. Maybe it was broadcast in 2005. Milton had died by the time we broadcast the biography. However, one of the gratifying things in my life was that we finished the biography for all intents and purposes early enough that in a private viewing at their apartment in San Francisco, Milton and Rose and Milton particularly, got to see the biography. And then he died between then and when it was broadcast. So that gives you a sense of the only physical remnant in the world of Milton and Rose Friedman and their life together and their contribution at a personal level is Kapitoff. And we are now working to turn it into a center for small group discussions and retreats to discuss Milton's public policy ideas. Now, what were those public policy ideas? Thank you, Jeff, for helping me with those photos. In the introduction to Capitalism and Freedom, I should check these and memorize them, but I don't. Sometime in the early 60s, Milton and Rose published their first book, Capitalism and Freedom, that was directed at a, if you would, a mass audience. It was not intended to be a textbook, although it has been and is still used widely as at least a supplemental text. And in the introduction, Milton Friedman spends a full page exploring JFK's inaugural address commentary, that famous quote, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." And I think Milton's assessment is a good way to give anyone who's listening today or listens at all at some point in the future, a sense of how Milton applied universal values to all kinds of human activity, and certainly to the issues of government and government's role. And what is it that we mean when we want a free society of individuals with the freedom to make decisions with regard to their own life? Well, keep in mind again, Kennedy said, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Milton's response, and I'll read you one paragraph, he expands on this if you want to go to the original of Capitalism and Freedom, but I just want to read one paragraph. This is Milton's assessment. Quote, "The free man will ask neither what his company can do for him, what his country can do for him, nor what he can do for his country. He will ask rather what can I and my compatriots do through government to help us discharge our individual responsibilities, to achieve our several goals and purposes, and above all, to protect our freedom. And he will accompany this question with another. How can we keep the government we create from becoming a Frankenstein that will destroy the very freedom we establish it to protect? And I hope you would all quickly recognize how appropriate that commentary is to what has happened over the past 3 months in early 2020, when the land of the free and the brave have been driven by fear-mongering into literally shutting down the entire country based on what I consider to be an inflated and exaggerated fear of this pandemic, COVID-19. And I think Milton's quote gives you a pretty fair sense of how he would respond to that, what he would recommend. And by the way, I think we're seeing a lot of reactions now that we're 2-3 months into this. We're seeing a lot of reactions that are consistent with Milton's thinking that we as individuals, we work through government to solve these problems, that government is our partner, but it is not our master in solving these problems. And I think that'll give anyone who's looking for a real quick summation of Friedman's approach to what is a free society, it's a good starting point, is his response to JFK. Now, my favorite quote from Free to Choose is at the end of program 5 on equality, titled Created Equal, and playing on Jefferson's famous words in the Declaration of Independence: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we're all created equal. Now, Friedman then, at the end of that program, and he explains a variety of ways you can interpret what equality should mean, and concludes that what Jefferson meant is that we would all be equal at the starting point, not that we would all be equal at the finish line. And at the very end of that program, the very final statement is Milton Friedman saying, this is, quote Milton, the society that puts equality before freedom will get little of either. The society that puts freedom before equality will get a great measure of both. Now, I think from my point of view, and there are an awful lot of ways I could explain to you what I learned from Milton Friedman in my 28-year postdoctoral session with Milton, many other Nobel laureates, and the many, many friends of Milton who, and learn from their experiences and their understanding of what free market capitalism is, and how do we employ it to secure the personal and political freedoms that we enjoy. And of course, Milton's thesis that you cannot have political and personal freedom without economic freedom. China currently is a test case in which Milton, by the way, went to his grave surprised that China had not already taken over Hong Kong. He thought China would move more aggressively than it has. Today, he also pointed out that the one major error he made in life was when he said that if you have economic freedom, it will eventually lead to political and personal freedom. And he qualified that late in life. He said, I forgot one thing. You must have rule of law. By the way, which means law that applies to everyone the same way. That if you want a rule of law, not a rule of individuals, not a rule of people. And China, you don't have rule of law. You have laws and rules based on what's the latest thinking in the regime, the higher ups in the Communist Party, and how do they feel about the degree to which they allow their citizens to have access to information. That's what it basically gets down to. If you can control access to information, you control those who, having access to that information, could understand how they were being abused, could also begin to understand how they might take steps to change that situation and to gain their personal and political freedom. It's going to be very, very interesting in the next year, the COVID-19 crisis and the degree to people are concerned that China is complicit in that. I think what it has done is sober us to really look at China from a realistic public choice theory. At least I think of it in public choice theory. And that is that the Chinese regime wants to be the dominant power in the world. That would be fine if it were Great Britain and the US competing. I believe that if those were the two contenders for the nation that was the most powerful in the world would probably fare fairly well, because we would probably be doing a race to the top. We would be engaged in which of the two countries opens up quickest and to the greatest degree, which country had the lowest tax rates, which country who had the freest trade, etc., and therefore which country was prospering to the greater degree, and which country do the rest of the nations in the world want to emulate. That would be a competition we could all relish and enjoy and gain the benefits from. But a competition with China or with Russia or with Venezuela, although we could solve the Venezuelan problem in a hurry if we were willing to put up with the public opinion reactions that were maybe negative, many of which might come from our friends at places like Reason and Cato, who would think that intervening there militarily would be unacceptable. That may be the case. I'm not making a judgment on it, although I am open to the possibility of military intervention, whereas Cato and Reason represents a point of view that would say that no, that's inappropriate for us. So I think that gives you a sense of what I've gained from my personal relationship with Milton Friedman, which lasted, by the way, from January of 1977, when I met Milton in a sublet apartment at the corner of California and Jones in San Francisco. And he opened the door, and this short little guy, 5'1", came to the door. Remember that. You're going to hear more about that later in one of the videos that cap it off about Milton's height. And we became good friends and colleagues and co-conspirators in a number of projects over the next decade, almost 3 decades, 28, 29 years. And it was truly a postdoctoral, but Milton understood something very critical, which was he understood that if you would open your eyes, see what's going on around you, apply even common sense analysis to it, maybe keep in mind the phrase, actions speak louder than words, and always be watching what people do more than what they say. Notice the contradictions that may occur between those two things. Gives you better sense of how to judge people and how to judge their commentary and their reactions to ideas. You end up really being fairly proficient in what is thought of as the economic way of thinking. And it's accessible to anybody. You don't have to take Econ 101. You can forget about the demand and supply curves. All you have to do is understand that the world is, what you see in the world is the result of choices, and it's the result of trillions of choices. I don't know what it would be, probably every month, there are trillions of choices in the world, in the marketplace, and in the political marketplace. And it's the sum total of those choices that gives us what we have, what's around us. And to recognize each of us in the choices we make each day are having far greater impact than the, now it's approaching $1 trillion we spend on political elections and the choices we make in the voting booth. Both of those activities having a very, very low rate of productivity in terms of getting what you want. But I've yet to be disappointed with my tube of Colgate toothpaste. Well, here's how it started. I met Milton at that apartment because Alan Wallace, Chancellor of the University of Rochester, he and I had gotten to know each other before I met Milton, because I was then the head of a public TV station in Erie, Pennsylvania. I'd become interested in these ideas, but again, from a common sense personal analysis, not because I'd read Atlas Shrugged or Capitalism and Freedom. I came to those after I began to understand I was someone you would maybe think of as an individualist, someone not very much swayed by what the crowd was doing, to the degree where my wife would tell you that she's absolutely certain that I have this desire to be different from everybody else. So it doesn't matter what you say, I'm going to disagree with it and I'm going to behave differently. Well, anyway, I began to understand that in a certain sense, that was a reflection of what we would call the classical liberal way of thinking, libertarian, conservative way of thinking, that individuals should be allowed to make most choices about what happens to them in life, that they're in the best position to determine what's best for them. So Alan Wallace and I got to know each other, got to realize we shared those views. John Kenneth Galbraith did his TV series called Age of Uncertainty, which from a TV point of view was not successful. By comparison with Free to Choose, it made very little impact. It disappeared rather quickly. But Alan then, when I said to him that I was keen to see a response to Galbraith, particularly as the head of a public TV station, and I had contributors, business people, who were saying, hey, how come PBS is running that left-wing thing with Kenneth Galbraith? Can't they do something else? And I told Alan Wallace, I really wish they did. And I said, in fact, I wish I could produce it. He said, oh, you really are interested in that? I said, yeah. He said, well, I think I know who should be the host of that series. And he introduced me to Milton Friedman. Introduced me in a phone call 10 days after Milton had been announced as the 1976 Nobel laureate in economics. That phone call met to that meeting in January of '77. Milton and Rose agreed to do Free to Choose. And we then spent a lot of time together. And it was interesting how it evolved. Early on in those discussions, Milton was a little bit skeptical of what kind of impact we would have. His position was, I really don't see how a TV series is going to help that much. He said, I can't imagine that a 1-hour TV show can persuade anybody of anything to a degree that if they watch a 1-hour show the next evening that puts forth a different view, they'll just change their mind to that view. So he was a little skeptical of what the impact would be. Although as we went forward over the 3 years between '77 and '80 when the show went on the air, it's interesting how his thoughts evolved. And they evolved partly because he was also beginning to have experience within television. And one in particular, he appeared on the Dinah Shore show. And he made the comment, he said, you know, Bob, I got more mail, more reactions to that show than to any of the appearances I did on Meet the Press or any of the others. And it was an interesting, it is available on YouTube if you search around. And one of the advices he gave, because that was during Carter and high inflation, and he said, oh, well, in that kind of environment, if you anticipate there's going to continue to be high inflation, then you should go out and buy a fur coat or a Cadillac or something expensive because it's going to be more valuable next year than it is this year. It becomes a hedge against inflation. But he then came to the conclusion too. He said, of course, my primary interest is, will it sell a lot of books? And did it sell a lot of books? 400,000 hardback copies in the US the first year, 1980. 600,000 hardback copies translated into Japanese in Japan in 1980. Millions of copies in various soft, over the years, soft cover books, et cetera, and translated into 30 plus different languages. But here's the interesting thing to me and what was gratifying, that in Britain, in the summer of 1979, I think it was, he recorded, and he was standing on a dock on the Thames, and he recorded a commentary about why he had done Free to Choose. And I'm going to read you two or three lines, direct quote from that. Quote, I do not know whether we can succeed in this venture, but I do know this is the most important thing I've done in my life. Now, obviously, from my point of view, you can't imagine how gratifying that was, because he had agreed to spend 2.5 years full time undertaking a project that I was shaping and directing. And I was not the producer, but I was shaping and raising the money for it. And the risk that I had taken without any experience in doing something like that, that I would disappoint this individual that I had come to have such great admiration for, not only as an economist, a scholar, but as an individual. And to have him recognize that it was that, and he did so, by the way, because of his understanding that socialism was rampant in the world. I can remember, I recently read a document I wrote at that time, and not absolutely exact on the high number. The number was this: Freedom House at that time said there were 44 countries in the world that were free and 156 that were not. And that was the time the Soviet Union and the Communist International concept was just rampant. And Free to Choose was certainly a response to Kenneth Galbraith's series, but more than anything, it was an attempt to respond to this tidal wave of socialist thinking that was dominating the world. And to that degree, we concluded, the Friedmans and I, that we did have an impact. Sadly to say, there was no follow-up. To this day, as you know, there has been no second Free to Choose. We did a short 5-hour series on CNBC in 1990, which was actually a failure in terms of reaching any significant number of people. And we've done a number of things for public television since then, but and with the exception of Commanding Heights, there's not been a single program series, TV program series, that has come close to both the scope and the impact of Free to Choose. Now let me conclude my comments, and I want to get to Q&A. And I think I'm going to skip the last video on Norman Borlaug. I'll just mention him. But I'd like you right now, Jeff, to get ready to play Blazer to the Pond. Because one of the things we've done at Kappa, I have attended many of the residential colloquiums we have. The residential colloquiums there are sponsored by colleges and universities. And the first one being with the University of Arkansas. The Sam Walton School of Business has sponsored a residential colloquium now at Kappa for 4 years running. And in a second here, I want to show you this video. But while students are there, I'm usually there, and I'll tell them a variety of anecdotal stories about Milton. Well, as it became obvious that the cancer was winning this battle, it was urged on me by the students who were attending and the faculty attending, and I thought it made sense myself that I would record a number of videos about my interaction with the Friedmans, and these videos then became a legacy that could be used at Kapitov for decades to come. And each of these are designed so that I'm talking to students who are visiting Kapitov as I said, in a decade from now. But this one, it'll give you a sense of how steep the hill is going up to Milton's house. But more importantly, also, it will give you a little glimpse into this man, Milton Friedman, the great scholar, who was also a pixie. He was like the economic elf. He had a twinkle in his eye, a curiosity that was nonstop, and just a wonderful joy of life. And I think if you'll play this video for people, this will give them a little sense of what's difficult for me to capture, but it's the best we can do. I'm not hearing any audio. I hope that can be corrected. We'll go back and we'll make sure we have some audio.
Let me see what I can do to adjust that.
I'm thanking you very much for that.
Let's see if this will make a difference here now. It says it's optimized. Let's see what this sounds like now. Let me restart. Hopefully this will work.
Milton Friedman really enjoyed automobiles and cars, and I'm sure he would really have loved this Gator. Now, some of you have probably already had a chance to ride in it, and normally at Kapitov we like to be sure everybody gets a chance to ride in the Gator in the woods and on the hills. Milton would have loved it. When he lived here, he had a Blazer. Now, Blazers at that time were big, huge box-like things, four-wheel drive. And when we were producing Free to Choose, in the summer of 1979, we came here for meetings. I think it was even over the 4th of July weekend, but we came here and had some meetings at Kapitov. And while we were here, my son Mark was with me and my family. And Mark was up at the house, and we were talking and looking out at the pond and Milton had an aluminum canoe in the pond at that time. And Milton said to Mark, would you like to go down and paddle around in the canoe? And of course, you can imagine, I think Mark was maybe 11, 12 years old, something like that. So Milton says, okay, let's get in the Blazer and we'll go down to the pond. Well, you can see how steep this hill is. Going up it, we can get up it and down it with the Gator pretty well. Now, obviously, Milton was able to get up and down it in the four-wheel drive with the Blazer, but it's a very steep hill. Now, you have to envision Milton 5'1", sitting in the Blazer, and like there's the dashboard, and there's Milton, and there's no way he could see very far because the Blazer had a big long hood on it. So we get in, and he starts driving straight down this steep hill toward the pond. And and I was fairly aware of automobiles, and I also had some sense of physics and the center of gravity, and whether or not this was going to work out well, because Milton comes charging down the hill. He can't see over the dashboard. We're getting very close to the pond, and all at once he just turns the wheel 90 degrees. So you can imagine you're coming down this hill, and he turns like that, and the normal inclination is for the car to then roll into the pond. It didn't, obviously. I'm still here, and I did not have to swim out of the pond to save myself. But that was Milton. He just loved doing all kinds of things like that. So Blazer to the pond is a memory that I have, and Mark remembers being there, but he doesn't really remember any of the details. In any case, I hope you have fun driving around the acreage here at Kapitoff and remembering that everywhere you go in Vermont is uphill.
Very good, like that end line there.
Yeah, well, I have to credit the Vermonters with that, because that's one of the favorite things that they point out. And if you're going to hike the trails at Kapitoff, you quickly find out that that is the case. You don't think about it while you're going downhill, but when you really discover that getting back to the house it is uphill, you end up going to quickly learning that you're going to get a good workout as you're tramping around the trails at Kapitoff. Now, I'd like to stop the formal presentation there. I don't know how much time you folks have for Q&A, but I'm certainly prepared to go on for at least the next half hour, 45 minutes, if you have questions that I could offer you any thoughts that you would find of any use.
Okay, great. Well, that was super, and it's nice to see how everything's kind of hopefully becoming a little more institutionalized with what all of you did to collectively over these years. And I definitely got bits and pieces of it. I liked all the free to choose in terms of school choice and everything that Milton engaged in later on in life and stuff. So definitely left a lot of stuff underway to continue on into the future, which is great. Quickie question, just kind of where you were first talking a little bit about, this shutdown that we suddenly had, all this fear and everybody, closed all the way down. And it's rather interesting that happened in spite of the fact that we have a president that's supposedly iconoclastic and is in many ways and did a lot of stuff to break the norm, yet somehow the system seemed to prevail over and above any of his instincts or direction or anything. What does that kind of bode for the future now that you've had such, two lifespans of collective hindsight, Milton's and your own?
Well, it's interesting that you raise that, because I'm going to share with you a story about Arnold Schwarzenegger. And it's interesting too, because he and, of course, President Donald Trump, have had some interesting interactions over the years. And the reason they've had conflicts is similar. The goal, the fundamental drive, the fundamental set of principles that guides Donald Trump and President Trump, and that has guided Arnold Schwarzenegger, is winning. Now think about that, winning. After Milton died, I made a considerable effort to be sure that Rose Friedman did not have the impression that now that Milton was gone, she didn't count. And I went out of my way to continue my probably every other month's visit to California from Pennsylvania in order to spend time with Rose. And in the process of doing that, did a variety of things to make the last 2.5 years of her life pleasant and productive. Well, one of the things I did was I got a hold of Arnold Schwarzenegger. He had been on my board of directors in the 80s and 90s. And I'd gotten to know him reasonably well. He introduces program, is it program 1 of Free to Choose? The 1990 version. I can't recall exactly which program. I think it is program 1 that he introduces. And you can find that.
It is. I have it up. It is. It's this one.
Right. And you can find that online and go there and listen to his commentary. But people would ask me, what happened to Arnold in California when he was governor? Well, 2 things. One, he lost those 3 initiatives. He went blazing out. He was well-intentioned. And he thought of himself as a classical liberal, a traditional libertarian. So he goes forward with 3 initiatives, each of which would have been a fabulous win for freedom. But he was so confident that he undertook all 3, and he ended up losing all 3. Now, Arnold was then faced with a dilemma. Did he continue to advocate for his principles, or did he do what he did as a bodybuilder and that is study very carefully what he had to do in order to win. And he certainly caved in quickly to, well, I'm going to do what it takes to win. And I want to come back and tie it to Trump and the COVID-19, but then here's what I did. I got a hold of Arnold after Milton died and said, Arnold, Rose would like to come and visit you. Now that was a lie. I hadn't asked Rose about that at all. I just wanted to have her go over and see him. So I said, would you be interested in hosting her at the Capitol in Sacramento? Rose at that time was living in a senior assisted place in oh, come on. UC Davis. Had to go that way. Davis, California. So she was convenient to drive over. Member of my board, Chris Ruffer, had a house on the Sacramento River. He agreed to go with me, and we went over, picked up Rose, and the three of us went and met with Arnold. Walked into his office, and it's hugs all around, it is handshakes. And it is Milton saying to Rose, and basically, I'll mimic him. He says, Rose, you got to understand, I am absolutely, Milton is my hero. He is absolutely a presence in my life. It's like he's sitting on my shoulder, whispering into my ear about ideas, etc., etc. Now, Rose, I know you don't think I'm listening. A politician to the nth degree. And it's clear to me, Arnold Schwarzenegger was driven his whole life by winning. And that's why, in effect, he gave up on the principles, which were solidly represented in those initiatives. And most people thought, well, no, it was Maria and the Kennedys that influenced him. They would not have influenced him if he had not read the polls correctly. Arnold was driven by public opinion, and he could see that those losses, 3 initiatives, voted down, and very soon he has to stand for re-election as governor, and nothing was going to stand in the way of him succeeding at that he then took the step to begin to embrace what we would consider to be kind of left of center ideas in terms of government. Now, how does that relate to Trump? I think in the case of the coronavirus, Trump has been he's kind of like, one of those open field runners in football. That once he breaks the whole initial huddle, the initial move, and he's downfield, it's all improvisation. And that's what Trump started to do. First, he improvises on terms of the kind of propaganda coming out of China saying, nothing to worry about, this is great, okay. Fortunately, he did have enough sense to close down travel from China. But then what happened? As the various fearmongers, and fearmongers not in an intentional way. I don't want to characterize the various doctors, the various politicians, as purposely saying, we're going to scare the hell out of the American public, and as a result of that, we're going to build up a lot more government activity. No, they simply did what was in their self-interest under public choice theory, which was, hey, we're in this position. I'm head of the Center for Disease, whatever. And what's my job? Well, I'm supposed to be the expert. Well, I'm going to act like the expert. And here's the data I have. And boy, I'm convinced this could be a huge disaster and 2 million people are going to die. And those were the kinds of numbers that were thrown out there. Now, what's Trump do? I agree with your assessment, Jeff, that I think Trump is not someone you can label in terms of his political positions easily. But he has a tendency to be more focused on individual freedoms, cutting regulation, allowing individuals and institutions to compete, and in competing, to sort out what the best answers are for problems that arise that we want to solve. And I think that explains his behavior. He's going to move in the direction he feels will get him a win when it comes time for his reelection.
Yeah, you know, it's either good or bad this occurred at this moment of his presidency, because that becomes a factor because it's this critical year. David,
Yep.
I see you've got your hand up.
Bob, this is David Demarest in Omaha.
Yes, David.
What influence did Ludwig von Mises and Austrian economics have on Milton and you, or vice versa?
First, a one-word answer, none. But before I lead you and others to the wrong conclusion, Friedrich Hayek had a lot of influence. The reason Mises did not have an influence on us, and I'm going to speak for Milton, because Milton did not accept Mises' a priori way of going at science. The fact that Mises would be willing to, and by the way, Mises walked out of the founding meeting of the Mount Pelerin Society. I don't know if you know that that's the case. It's recorded, I think it's even in Milton's memoirs, that at that meeting, I think close to the, I think it may have even been near the end of the first day, Mises got up, stormed out of the meeting, having said to the group, "You're all a bunch of statists," and left. So Milton did not embrace, or even, I'm sure he read von Mises' work, etc., but he did not take it to heart. He did not consider it to be that valuable, because Mises was unwilling to put his ideas into falsifiable form of theses that could be tested through research. And that's a direct quote from Milton. He told me flat out, he said, I just can't quite come to grips with von Mises, because in his view, he has the answers and there's no need for any further discussion.
Was Hayek a little more flexible in that regard?
Hayek was open to having those discussions.
Mm.
And at the 1978 Mount Pelerin meeting in Hong Kong, Hayek and Friedman debated the private issuance of currency. And Hayek was for it, Milton was against it. Interesting lesson here, however. Milton made it clear he was against it for utilitarian reasons. Now, despite the fact that Ron Paul made it clear to me he doesn't like utilitarian way of thinking. Nonetheless, from a utilitarian point of view, Milton argued against Hayek. He said, in principle, I like the idea. I like the idea that freedom should extend to the private issuance of currency. However, I believe that the average person would suffer greatly from that, because they would be so subject to manipulation by those who devoted themselves to literally figuring out how they could use the private issuance of money to defraud people. Later in life, Milton moved toward a more sympathetic position on private issuance of money. And he and Hayek collaborated and were good friends. And in fact, I spent a lot of time with Hayek, because I arranged for a recording of a series of discussions between Hayek and other notables, and took him on let's see, it ended up being about a 10-hour tour of the wine country in Napa Valley, he and I and his wife. So I knew Hayek very well, and he was cordial, communicative, and not combative in the sense of, I don't want to talk about your ideas because you're stupid or your statist. No, he was willing to engage in a discussion as to whether his ideas were correct or not, or whether Milton's ideas were correct. I never met Mises. I cannot judge the man. I can only report to you that Milton's conclusion was Mises was not open to that kind of exchange.
Very good. All right, Charles, I see you've got your hand up.
Several questions come to mind. Since you're bringing up other economic titans, Bob, the next question from an Austrian after Mises, and I would love to see a link, Jeff, Bob, on the Hayek recordings, if you have those linked anywhere. That would be a good thing to advertise.
Well, they're at free-to-choose.
But my question...
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, my question was, what about Rothbard? Did you have any interaction with him and Friedman?
I had one lunch meeting with Murray, and it was just not a successful meeting at all, in that Murray recognized quickly, he would have said that I drank the Friedman Kool-Aid, and therefore he saw no reason for us to engage intellectually in too deep a discussion. However, he was certainly interested, and I think had I been impressed with Murray, I certainly met with him with the idea that maybe we could work together, he and I, in doing something for mass media of some kind. But I went away from the meeting understanding that he too, like Milton reported to me about Mises, there was no room for discussion with Rothbard. It was either this is the way or the highway. So I did have that from a personal experience. And I also, by the way, Milton and Rothbard had a very, very rocky relationship. And Rothbard is one of only 3 people that Milton identified in his life as people that he had no respect for.
Interesting response there. What about anybody that's kind of out there right now who's sort of following in Milton's footprints and kind of moving some of this forward, thinker-wise?
Well, let me continue with the Austrian, if you would, monetarism dichotomy.
Please.
And mention Peter Boettke, who has said repeatedly publicly that free to choose opened his eyes and led him to a career as a professional economist. Number one. Number two, that he thinks of Free to Choose, the TV series and the book, as far more important than Capitalism and Freedom, because being a TV show and then a book based on the transcripts of the TV show, not the reverse. Most PBS series, somebody wrote a book and then the book became the basis of the TV series. Not the case with Free to Choose. And the result of that is Free to Choose, in my view, is about the most accessible book on economics you can buy. That the language used, the examples used, the stories are ones that the average person can relate to and relate it to their own personal experiences. And I think that that's, and Peter Boettke, as an Austrian, very comfortable with Friedman in the universe of advocates for freedom. But I assume you do know that there are Austrians who do not want to include Friedman in their pantheon of the gods of personal freedom.
Why would you suspect that? Just as more for political purposes or animosity, just personality-wise, or?
Oh, I think it's, first of all, believe me, and you all know this, that competition, even bitterness, bitter rivalries, it is stock and trade within the academy. I mean, the backbiting, the intensity of competition among scholars is the equal of any between titans of industry. And therefore, there's always going to be this. I mean, There are people at the University of Chicago, Nobel laureates, who were advocates of Friedman ideas in a sense, meaning they made their own way. They were in the classical liberal tradition. They were comfortable with many of Milton's ideas. They disagreed with some of them, but oh my heavens, why? It was almost like I think a spouse of one of them once asked me, well, Bob, why are you always doing TV with Milton? Why don't you do it with X, her husband? The answer was, X was a great economist, but not a very good communicator.
To that end, Bob, Charlie here, the theme of this show was, in part, your Free to Choose series impact on the Reagan Revolution and the free market revolution, more broadly speaking. Tell us quickly about that. I mean, what was the short-term impact of your 1980 work, and how did it really impact the world?
Okay, well, you're going to have to accept the fact that there's a certain degree of discomfort for me to answer that and answer it in a way that I think is honest, because it does give me a fairly big pat on the back. If you remember, Milton and Rose and I, we set out to have a strong impact. I mean, Milton stood there on the wharf on the Thames and said, I think this is the most important thing I've done in my life. We've got to contradict, we've got to somehow or other turn this back, turn the tide of socialism back. Well, I think that we succeeded in doing that. And I think our impact, if you put it in the context of the Reagan Revolution, it was one of the factors that allowed Reagan in his 8 years to start the nation and the world, in partnership with Margaret Thatcher, thinking about, we've been going down the wrong path. It's time to get back to those things that made Britain great in the 19th century, those things that made the US great in the 20th century. So in that sense, we certainly had the goal of changing the world. Now, did we? Well, the first time I actually felt that I was comfortable saying to anybody and admitting to anybody that, yeah, I think I can say I changed the world and do so in a meaningful way, meaning that the statistics show that Milton Friedman, with my meager assistance and the TV series Free to Choose in the book, did impact the world enormously. When you had countries, Czechoslovakia, Estonia, Mongolia, where as they emerged from the Iron Curtain, all credited Free to Choose the book with being a guide toward the policies and the structure of government that they established in their newly free countries. Well, boy, that's pretty good evidence that you've had impact, when you have evidence that nations were built with the idea that the principles in Free to Choose were solid and should be embraced. And of course, the sale of millions of copies of the book and the millions who watched the various translations of the TV series give you one to ponder. Free to Choose was so successful that one of the foreign language versions is a special 5-hour version with Arabic soundtrack over Milton Friedman. And so Milton speaking Arabic.
That's pretty interesting. So what do you think, though, the world's continually been marching more and more towards freedom over the years. You just sort of see that, other than like Venezuela in little pockets. But now suddenly it seems like this instantaneous decision, we need to take a hard, good look at socialism. How's that going to prevail based on the way things traditionally and trajectory have been running?
Well, two things. One, the absence of another free to choose or even ongoing series of those. Bill Buckley's firing line, should have mentioned earlier, it was useful, but it was not. Bill and I were friends, but I would say that Bill was also a little bit, he was focused, but not in a way that captured the average person. And near the end of Milton's life, he and I had a discussion in which I suggested to Milton, we were both very troubled by what we were seeing. Berlin Wall, remember, came down in 89, 90. At that time, the whole 90s was free markets have won. Well, if that was the case, how was it that you then elect a Republican in 2000 who then goes on and expands government like crazy, irregardless of 9/11? 9/11 you couldn't do anything about except respond. But certainly Bush too did everything he could to expand government. Compassionate, whatever. And then comes along Obama. Well, you get more government growth. And Milton and I talked about it in the early 2000s, just before he died. And I said to him, I said, Milton, Program 5 of Free to Choose gives us the answer. Program 5, created equal. The clarion call of equality is what is beating us over the head, is making socialism attractive. And we have not been focused. We have not been laser-like in our efforts to reach the average voting person with examples of why socialism, as Tom Sowell said, and we have it on, it's part of a biography of Tom Sowell that we've created, which will be on public television sometime in the next year and a half or so. And in there, we take a piece from a recording I did with Tom in the mid-90s, I'm sorry, in about 2005, in which Tom comments on why he moved from being a Marxist to being a free market capitalist. And he said, and Walter Williams has said it in a different way, he said, socialism is wonderful in principle. It sounds terrific. It has resonance with religions and one's dedication to love thy neighbor as thyself. It just fits so well within our sense that love can drive the world, that we can have a world of peace if we can just all love each other well enough, etc. And we haven't addressed that in an effective way. And we're at a loss. Alan Wallace once made the point, until we have a response that appears in the evening news that is as emotional and grabs people's attention and gets them excited about free market capitalism, unless we can present them with images of people's success within that system that can equal and counterbalance the image of a single mother and her children sitting outside of an apartment from which they've been evicted, we will lose the battle for freedom.
It's a very interesting place for us to kind of conclude for today on that thought. So I do really appreciate you spending some really, really great time with us today.
I'd be delighted to come back anytime.
We'll definitely take advantage of that offer.
And I'd love to spend a lot of time talking about Hayek if you wanted. But I also want to leave you then with Norman Borlaug and to do some research on Norman Borlaug. And I'll try to remember to send you a quote from Norman that appears in that video that may tempt you to want to spend one of your shows with us talking about Norman and his contribution to the world.
Okay, well, we'll definitely include that when we release this video. So I appreciate you doing that for us. And again, we'll reconvene here again. Thanks for today.
Thank you. Enjoyed it very much. Thank you, all those who tuned in.